Thank you for joining us this evening. I am your host, and for those that do not know me, my name is Katrina. I'm the outreach worker at the Irish Support Agency. I would like to begin with a welcome to country tonight. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Irish Support Agency acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I also wish to acknowledge that this evening's content around the topic of domestic violence may be difficult. I encourage you to care for your safety and well-being. There is no requirement to have your camera on. Should you also require support following tonight's discussion, Una, our project officer, will provide some details in the chat box, including how to access our Solace Counselling service. If you also have any questions, please put your questions into the chat box, and should we have time at the end, we will try and answer those. Okay. Domestic and family violence can affect anyone in the community. While both women and men can use or be subjected to domestic and family violence, the overwhelming majority of such violence in Australia is perpetrated by men against women. It is a widespread issue that can have an impact on the community, workplace, families, and individuals. And sadly, it is a leading cause of death or serious injury for women under 45, with more than one woman murdered each week by a current or former partner. We are joined this evening by Marie Crody, team leader of a domestic violence refuge with St. Vincent de Paul, Saoirse Conlon, Solace practitioner and experienced clinician, and Áine Tyrrell, professional musician and mum. So I'd like to welcome all three of you. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to get right into tonight's questions, and hopefully by the end of it all, we should have a really good idea of what domestic violence is and how to maybe recognize the signs and respond. So Saoirse, when we think about domestic violence, people often go straight to physical abuse with visible signs. What other ways can abuse materialize, and what are those signs?
Thanks so much for the question. It's actually like a really vital one. You know, I mean, there's so much talk at this time about things like different types of violence within our world. I just want to acknowledge just quickly before I go forward about just to pay homage to those with lived experience. Some of us are here now, but also some of those that might be tuning in at some point down the track. Certainly when we talk about violence, you know, we talk about justice to the rights of any person, often like a woman, that, as you mentioned before. But I think other than being able to see the signs of violence with our eyes, it's also really helpful to ask the right kind of questions to just get a sense of what actually might be going on for somebody. And there's a whole list of different types. And I think whilst we can access that list quite easily, I just thought I might talk about some of the kind of things that people might be noticing but not see it as actually being violence. So it might be within like a partnership, they might be feeling like a little bit off balance, or like they don't know what's right and wrong. Feelings like of walking on eggshells. Spiritual like abuse, so maybe being stopped from going down the track of your faith. Being forced to do things that you don't want to do, damage to self or like to other people. And sometimes it can be just merely threats of that. So people can feel, even though they haven't been actually harmed, that they worry because of the way that the person actually behaves, that there is a threat of that violence. Things like being stalked, being put down. Like quite often what people don't see as being violence is kind of like the put downs and the feeling that chipped away at. Women quite often talk to me about kind of losing themselves, like getting a sense that they used to feel certain ways about things, and then over a period of time, they're really not sure what they think about things anymore. And in fact, sometimes they take on the kind of viewpoint of the person that they're with, because sometimes it's safer to do that, but sometimes as well, it's because it's a bit you can feel a bit off balance. You can feel that you thought you knew yourself, and then suddenly 6 months in, 12 months in, like a few years down the track, it's kind of hard to know like which way is up. You know, you can doubt your own judgments. I mean, it can start as things like the perpetrator wanting to check your phone, know where you've been, jealousy, asking you lots of questions, and sometimes also beginning like to kind of chip away at the people you feel close to. So they might cast doubt on your closeness to your family, like for example, and then over time women can find themselves a little bit on their own. Because one of the things to say as well is that because of the fact that women don't always know how the people like in their lives will actually like respond if they do talk about violence, and because of the sense of loyalty to like the perpetrator, because of that closeness, because things aren't always hard, right? Sometimes things are great, sometimes things are lovely, and most women will find that they actually really just want that guy all the time. They want the one who says things can be better. They want the guy who can be absolutely really lovely. So like a lot of times women are hoping that by helping that person, by being with that person, by supporting that person, the things that are violent about like the partnership might actually like be able to get solved. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's lots of different ways that it can happen. And it's often not there from the very like beginning, because I think most of us would say, if you went out on a first date with a guy who awful up, then you probably wouldn't go out with him again. So it's like a gradual like experience like that women talk about, where there's a bit of a flip, where suddenly the person they thought they knew becomes like a different kind of guy, but not all the time. So I hope that gives you like a bit of a sense of what other ways it could show up. Yes, if you're hurt, then it's obviously like very clear, but sometimes the hurt can be hard to like identify, and also hard like for other people to actually know what's happened to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Because they're really real life examples, what I would say. You know, sometimes it's hard to actually imagine how that may happen. And Áine, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot now, because from listening to another interview of yours, some of what Saoirse was saying there is what I heard you mention before.
It's quite amazing when I hear other women's stories, or like a professional like Saoirse saying things back, and I'm like, well, yeah, that ticked every single one of those boxes. But when you're going through that, what Saoirse mentioned there is so relevant, is that you're living on the hope of change all the time. You're just constantly living on that, that it'll get better, or this is just a bad patch, or this is because of and I think when you start making excuse after excuse after excuse, that's, you get down this rabbit hole of completely losing yourself, like she said. But yeah, I would say everything she mentioned there is something that I experienced over a 10-year relationship in domestic violence, and from women that I know that have experienced the same thing. It's scarily textbook, you know, like there are things that happen, behaviors like keeping you slowly chipping away at the values maybe of your family, or your friends, or the people around you. And that seems to be like this consistent, you know, a lot of the things she mentioned are not just my own experience, you know, and will be a lot of other women's experience, which kind of you turn around, you're like, whoa, are they reading from the same handbook? But I think it's just this handbook of control, you know, when they're out of control, they've got to control something, and you happen to be that person at that time.
Wow. And look, I think we're really fortunate here in Australia and in Ireland too, that there's some amazing organisations out there. And I want to draw attention to one in particular. So Marie, maybe I can get you to speak to this. So what happens when someone makes that call to 1-800-RESPECT or any other helplines out there?
Okay. So they would be referred to a domestic violence agency, something like St Vincent de Paul or WAJEC or one of the other agencies, and a referral would be sent through. So then the next thing that happens, then I would get a referral through, and I would do a risk assessment on the family. So the risk assessment being like what's the risk areas, where does the partner work, where does he socialize, is this the right area for them? Also, is there any mental health background? Is there any medical issues like with the kids, autism or something like that? So you got to consider what refuge is right for them, whether they want to go to a small place, do they have medical issues that they need 24/7 staff? So we've got to take all these things into consideration. And then once the risk assessment is done and you decide which refuge they're going to and that, so then you make arrangements with them. When is it safe for them to leave? You've got to do some safety planning around that as well. Sometimes, so like maybe when the partners are working, or if the partner is not working, maybe when he goes out to get some grocery shopping or whatever. So you have a lot of things to consider, for them to escape safely. Sometimes it could take weeks. Sometimes it's a question of how can I safely leave? They want to plan. So you would like ask them, do they have a support person here in Sydney? Do they have a friend that they can slowly give documents to, like their passport, their ID, birth certs? Another thing too is do they have their own bank account? If they don't, like to start putting a few bob away every week to, to have some money when they leave, and also, if possible, to have some clothes somewhere else as well. A lot of the calls that they get sometimes is about, like, how can I do this safely? What do you recommend? Sometimes it's only they might need counselling. If they want to work on their relationship, it could only be like, where can I get counselling? How can somebody help me? And it could be around legal advice, like not being an Australian citizen and they're on a partner visa or something like that. So there's all these different issues to consider.
Absolutely. And like that was going to be one of my next questions, was around the implications for someone on a temporary visa or that's de facto on a partner visa that find themselves in a domestic violence situation, because from attending DV training in the past myself, like that was something that was huge, and that a lot of women actually comment on that are not Australian born, that this visa has been held over them and that they'll be deported, and maybe the country that they're from isn't very safe, or they don't have.
So your partner, he cannot cancel your visa. So if they're like waiting, if their partner's a PR or a citizen, there is a provision under the DV, there's a DV provision in immigration where if they deem that the relationship is genuine, they are still entitled to their own citizenship or own PR. So the partner can never hold that over them, that he can cancel the visa. He can stop the support, he can withdraw his support, and he can inform immigration, but he cannot cancel the visa.
And I think that's so important, because I think that's a lot of Irish maybe could be finding themselves in that situation and really not know where to turn. And it's good to know that immigration actually have got that in place. And I think most of the banks in Australia as well have got a program for people.
They have a program. They even have a grant for people escaping domestic violence and wanting to set up, I think it's like a $2,000 grant. That if you're, especially with Commonwealth Bank anyway, I know it's a $2,000 grant. If you're a customer and you're escaping domestic violence, they will give you $2,000 to set up your new home.
That's fantastic. Like it's something, and it maybe enables them to get on their feet if they're not entitled to Centrelink or other means. But
even the agencies, we also support them setting up their new home. Like we would give them, we would buy them furniture and white goods and have them set up their new home, and also give them some money to start up with.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's so good to know that there's agencies like St. Vincent and others out there that can help in all the different ways. It sounds like a really person-centered support service. Okay. And I suppose now that in New South Wales we're coming out of lockdown, it's really timely that we're having this conversation tonight. One of the questions that I had thought of is coming out of lockdown, you know, many of us are going to see family members or friends for the first time in months. How can we give them a safe place to disclose? Or if we have suspicions, how can we determine their safety? And maybe we'll start with you on that one, Marie.
Okay, so this is something a lot of people are scared to talk about. So first of all, you got to build up the trust and you know, let them know that you're there for them. They may not always take your advice. They could stay in the relationship for another 5, 6, 7 months, whatever. But in the end, they always reach out to somebody. And again, it's all about safety planning, like planning when it's safe for the mom and when it's safe for the kids to leave. So it's about being there, like being somebody even on the other end of a phone to support them when there's time to leave or when they want to plan to leave.
Yeah.
Like the plan around the practical things, as I said already, like their ID, which is very important, maybe the baby's blue book, birth certs, yeah, all the practical things that they need when they leave.
Absolutely. And look, I can imagine if someone had attempted to leave without them practical things in place, and they probably are going to return to the home again if things become too difficult.
Well, they can always take out an AVO, like with the police, and a recovery order. So, like that's when, it can be a support staff that can go with them and the police to do a recovery order and get all their items back. That happens quite a lot, and they can get a recovery order when they get an AVO.
Oh, fantastic! That's really good to know. And Saoirse, how do you think, coming from your experience as a practitioner, again, same question, coming out of lockdown, this is something that I think is going to be huge, given the last few months that we've had here,
Oh, yeah. Totally. I think just something that I would like to kind of say around that is that at the beginning it looks like. So it can, I think, can you hear me? I'm sorry, sorry if my net goes a bit funny. Hate that. We have a society that isn't always welcoming of victim blaming, you know, and a bit hurtful without realizing it. So I think, as was said before, first step is we've really got to be willing to believe the woman and actually what she's going through. And some of the barriers that women talk about is when they then get questioned. Sorry, my cat. When they then get questioned about things, or they worry that the person that they're talking to is going to take the side of the perpetrator. So it's been really clear that you're open to hearing what's being said, that you believe the woman, that you hear her when she says that she's afraid or she's not sure, and that we recognize that violence is a pattern. You know, it's not just a one-off thing. So if a woman's talking to you about one thing that's happened, chances are it's because lots of other things like that have happened as well. So it's unlikely that someone would come and disclose to you just a one-off, although they might. I would be curious about wanting to know more. And as was said, we need to make sure that women know that they're in control, that you're not going to take the control from them about what they want to do next, and that often the woman in that space knows more than anybody all the different things that she's got to actually contend with. She knows the person's, you know, every single move. She knows exactly what her children need if they're kids. She knows exactly what needs to be done to keep safe. So if we can build on the strength, as was said, around safety planning, but also not hold the expectation that people actually want to leave. So they might be telling you about the violence because they're checking it out. They just want to have a bit of a chat. Does this seem right to you, or is this just me, or is something going on here? So it might take a series of conversations. And I think what we have to really be thinking about power and control, which is so dominant in these spaces, that we don't by pushing our kind of expectations on women, take the control from their hands, because as you said, like before, it can take many, many times to leave. It can take years to leave. And in fact, the woman might not be sure that she wants to leave at all, because they have hopes and dreams for this partnership. So I think being really open, trustworthy, letting the woman know that you're not going to do anything without her like permission, that you're going to work with her, not for her, or like do things for her, can just help to set the scene, because we don't know what's going on really. She's the only one that really knows what's happening, and chances are there's actually like a lot more to the picture. And as I think we might have said like before, but sometimes, you know, we just want to be able to plant the seed, that, you know, there are kind of options available like to women. But I think just to mention quickly is that our world can tend like to minimize like women's worry sometimes, and crazy like tendency of kind of siding with perpetrators by saying, oh, do you think he really meant that, or are you sure that's what he said, or maybe he was having an off day or whatever. So we've got to be really careful that we're listening to what the woman's saying, because she really is like the expert in that space.
I can see Áine nodding along. Is that something that you felt in your own experience, Áine, that other people's opinions maybe were trying to encourage you to stay, or?
Yeah, I mean, I left the relationship once prior to the final time leaving it. So I had 2 experiences of leaving. And I think in both experiences, what was obvious is after I left, all these people were like, yeah, we really thought this, and this was a bit weird. Like this and this was weird. Like that was really strange. And in a way, when I would say things like that to people in conversations, they wouldn't necessarily validate back how strange that was to me, because they're also in the circle, you know, they might be friends with the husband, or they might be friends with someone else in the circle. And so I think, you know, validating back, if a woman says, oh, this is a bit strange, you know, which is I think how it starts, you know, as in like, he's a bit weird about this, or this is a bit, and that's kind of testing the water. And I think if you have a gut instinct that that is something that's a little bit, oh wow, that's a bit off, I think validating that back, because I mean, the times that I left now, you know, there's been a lot more conversation publicly about domestic violence. And I think as a society, we're open to these conversations more. I think the word domestic violence wasn't really even in use at the 2 times that I left. You know, it's been 6 years since I've been out of the relationship now. And we were just starting to use that word, you know.
Yeah.
Now you see it when you're like Centrelink has stuff about it, or like the bank has like a notice about it, or, you know, it's kind of everywhere where it wasn't before. So I think we're all a little bit more aware of what those signs are. And if I think validating back was something that they all told me after retrospectively. I was like, oh, I wish in that moment when I was like, you know, a few things happened publicly or around other people, and I felt awful shame, you know, like, oh my God, like I took all on the shame and the guilt, and everyone there was placing that on him, but no one stepped up and said that at any of those points. And I think to be, you know, that's kind of that innocent bystander stuff. And I think that we can, as friends and family members, kind of just step in and be like, you know, that's not really cool. Are you guys getting help for this? Or like, what are you doing, you know, for that conversation? I think my family in particular knew that first time I left, they kind of had their instincts that it wasn't going to be the final time. And it's hard because your partner and your family end up like in this push and pull, and you're kind of in the middle of it. And as well, being in a different country for me added like a complexity to it. And I think for anyone Irish tuning in or having friends who are Irish, you know, that does add that complexity to it. And so your friends really become the people that see you day in, day out, and see your children and see the relationship as it is. And yeah, you're not always ready to disclose all the biggest, weirdest stuff, or the dangerous stuff, or and I also think sometimes it's not your closest friends that are able to say that to you. It's kind of those next friends, like those kind of, I know for me, like 3 months or 4 months before, well, actually probably would have been about 6 months before I left, it was a kind of a not very, very close friend that was like, you do know you have to leave. And that moment for me sunk, but then it was 6 months before I could find the safe way out, but it was kind of, she kind of pulled me up on that, and she was like, for your babies, you have to do this. And I was like, yeah, you're right. But I don't think one of my really close friends could have said that at that time, because they were a little bit too enmeshed with my kids and him and our dreams and their dreams. And, so yeah, so like those friends that you kind of meet, maybe might go for a walk and they might say something like, sometimes it's not your closest ones, or beauticians or hairdressers. I know you spoke about that before, and I think it's really important, because like for me, it did, like I was disclosing stuff to a beautician far before, and she's actually a friend to this day now, like, but I hadn't, like, I just kind of incidentally said stuff in the safety of that space when I couldn't really say those words out loud to people that knew him and me and my kids,
Absolutely. And usually then people like your beautician or your hairdresser may not know him, and there's something about being inside those four walls where it does feel safe. And it's amazing in Australia that a lot of beauticians and hairdressers are now trying to get that training as well.
Yeah.
Recognize the signs, and it's somewhere that you safely can go, because that's somewhere maybe that it's part of your routine every few months or every few weeks.
Yeah.
And
they might notice, little bruises or little things. And, like there are things that sometimes people that see you on a regular basis in that way of intimacy, that you share with, they're not necessarily your closest. Yeah, I think that's really good to sort of be aware of as friends as well. Like it's not necessarily that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think something that's really important is, and fair to say, is some people in an abusive relationship may not actually realize that this is domestic violence. Saoirse, can you maybe speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think that is definitely the case sometimes. Like Áine just so beautifully like described, if we follow our gut feelings, if we kind of get the opportunity to test things out, we can often kind of put the picture together over time, the pieces of the puzzle, things that kind of feel a bit weird or not right. But quite often, for like a few reasons, women might feel that it's not like abuse, but they're just managing someone who's difficult, or he's like emotional, or he's had a traumatic experience, or he's just under a lot of stress, or, so there's lots of ways that whilst we might call it like abuse, people going through these experiences either may not be ready to call it that, or might be still putting the pieces like together, and also have hopes and dreams that if we can just get past this patch, then maybe we can move on to have the life that we wanted. Like if there are kids involved, there's heaps to consider. So I would say that, most women we would be talking to know who they are, know what they want. But what gets in the way is like the perspective of the other, that like entrapment that people can feel, the real risks of, if I see it as abuse, what am I going to have to do next? If I see it as abuse, what does it mean for my children? If I see it as abuse, what are they about me? We still have a tendency to make like abuse like a woman's problem, not a man's problem. So we tend to focus on the characteristics of the woman and what is she doing or not doing to manage the violence, rather than she is entrapped by a very systematic form of violence that is like designed to have you questioning yourself, you know. So we you know, because we still tend to talk about violence in that way, the women can sometimes feel like it's a character flaw, like on their behalf, you know, that if they've gone through that. I certainly know that I have felt that, like in my past as well. And also because, you know, overwhelmingly the people that experience violence are women who really care, you know, doctors, lawyers, nurses, like people that care about other people. So you'll tend to find a situation where a woman who really cares about the partner that they love will actually be willing to like invest quite a lot into them. And so whilst they might not see it as like abuse at the start, there is a definite, it's almost like I feel for myself, and also all the thousands of clients that I've walked alongside and kind of heard their stories, it's like you're always weighing it up. You know, what does it mean if it is abuse? What does it mean if it isn't? You know, are the good things about the partnership kind of outweighing the hard things? If I manage all of these different things, if I keep everybody safe, if I just don't say X, Y, and Z, can I hold the relationship? Can I keep the partnership? It's a very, you know, understandable way to want to go in life, because we all want love and we all want our dreams to come true. So it's absolutely the case, but as has already been like described, sometimes in very like severe cases, women are in places where they actually don't know how to make like decisions about what they need next, and they might need that like support. But quite often behind all of the difficulties and the gaslighting and the self-doubt is a woman that actually does know what she wants. So part of like the intervention or the like support is to help them to safely unpack that without like the expectation really of anything, so that, you know, they can kind of come to terms over time with maybe what would it mean if it was abuse? What would it say about me? What would it say about him? What would others say? What do I do next? So those are just some thoughts. Yeah.
I think that's so helpful. Thank you, Saoirse. And Áine, you had mentioned it had taken 6 months for you to leave from that conversation for the last time. And I think in one of our conversations before, you had mentioned that you left that town, then those people, like you moved away, and a lot of that was around people knowing your story then, and that being
yeah I think it is hard. You do hold some of that shame and guilt, you know. I mean, and also safety was an issue for me in that town. I tried to stay at the start, but yeah, it just became too unsafe, really. And I think that your question to Saoirse before about, you know, is it violence? I mean, it's taken me years to piece together things that courts and judges and police officers, you know, said to me. You've clearly been the victim of domestic violence. We've had, you know, victims of crime tribunals. We've had like all this paperwork that says all this stuff, and you still sit there and you it's hard to call it that, you know, just for yourself. It's hard to call it that for my children and know that that's a truth and a trauma that they carry now as well, you know. So it's a really hard thing to face, and I think it's a really good point Saoirse made, is that a lot of the time we are very caring, empathetic people that might end up in this situation, and you just keep thinking, oh, he's just going through this struggle right now, or this, and that can make, you know, it's kind of like making little mathematical equations to being like, okay, well, if that and that match up, then this will work, and then that'll work. But I think the thing that I worked out, and I've sort of seen in other women and other events that I've been part of like this, if you feel in a way that you're laying the tracks out in front of you and your partner and your kids, that you're like, for me, I kind of felt like I was always laying these train tracks out. Like I had to be a few steps ahead of us all the time so that he didn't fall off the track, basically, because if he fell off, then we were completely unsafe. And that can be physical, mental, that can be so many things. And I think you'll know that you can start to look at that if you're in a relationship where you're constantly having to be a few steps ahead to lay everything out smoothly. I think that's a bit of a clue for yourself if you're not able to say, hey, this is coercive control or this is domestic, because they're huge concepts. To for me, it was really hard to admit and to see that the perpetrator of violence on my kids was their father. Like that was really, it was a disconnect in me for a little, where I just was like, I it doesn't make sense. And a lot of it was happening when I wasn't there. So like I couldn't, like 2 + 2 just couldn't equal 4 in my head for a little while. And so I think, a way to sort of understand that feeling, for me anyway, and I've heard other women speak about it similarly, is if you're always having to stay ahead of them to make sure that everything is, like you're walking on eggshells, that idea, like if you're always having to lay that out, if you can't just kind of be, then there's, something to definitely question there. But
that's really powerful. Thank you for that. And look, I guess you have been through the Irish system. So the first time that you left the father of your children versus the Australian system. What would you say are the key systemic differences between reporting your abuse in Ireland versus Australia?
I think, as I said earlier, we've come a long way since both of those, but I'm still in various processes of having to stay safe still here. So I still do use the support services available to me and have to engage regularly with, different services. I would say that in Ireland, there was a sense of just kind of familiarity, where I was like, okay, well, that's the Garda station, that's courthouse, I know these things. You might know a brother of a somebody who's in, like there's kind of this familiarity, even though I had never been through that. No one in my family had been through those services before. Just like someone with a similar accent and experience to you. That's why it'd been amazing if I had met a Marie along my way. I just sort of probably hugged the bones off of her. But so I think that, and the other thing was, like, when we went through it in Ireland, it was very like, he kind of messed up very early on and there were no second chances. Kind of, it was a very clear and cut order that was handed down. And I found, going through the court systems and the police system here in Australia, when I went through, and I have seen in my process of still having to go through stuff, I've seen massive growth. So there's a lot of hope there. Like, but I did find there's a lot more chances given, and I don't know whether that is also because I was not familiar. I don't understand the words or the, it's the same language, but like there's cultural differences, and also, like my dad, and my cousin and somebody else came up for the court hearing when I went through it, and they were with me. I was going into these court hearings here and just all by myself, and you're there, and like the public can come in and they're listening to your like story. It's just like you're sitting there going, oh, there's just some things that need to change, and I think they are trying to address those, and there's a lot of incredible people and places out there. I've been the beneficiary of using the support of St. Vincent de Paul's different times during my journey, and having to lean on rely on the generosity and care of community workers like that. And there's this beautiful, I found the heroes are the like people like Marie, the domestic violence workers on the ground. They're like they're the people that held me and my kids in our time of need. The courts, you're just another number. The police, they're getting so many calls every day. You're just another, and I found the people that really stopped and took the time to care. And, so I would, I wish in a way that I had reached out earlier. I didn't know that St. Vincent de Paul existed. I didn't know that there were these services where I kind of knew like the names of something, like I knew like the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre existed, or I knew like a few things existed at home that kind of were like little words that I had heard around. Whereas when I got here, it's like when you arrive here, nobody gives you a pamphlet and says, here's all the domestic violence services that you may ever need. Like, it's not part of the brochure of emigrating to Australia.
No.
Yeah.
And look, I can hear from you that warmth and that love and respect that you have for those people that really took care on the ground, as you say, the workers like Marie, the people in the refuges, which is just amazing. And I guess probably going through the courts and police stations and reporting breaches of AVO can sometimes, not always, because as you said, the supports and services have come a long way in New South Wales, and every police station now should have a DV liaison officer, but not everyone is going to have a positive experience with reporting. And I guess a really important point that I want to make is that shouldn't deter people. Like, that maybe will put someone off from reporting again because they've had this experience where maybe they've been questioned or not taken seriously, or there's been no action taken, and the perpetrator of violence gets away with it yet again. And I guess, Marie, Saoirse, Áine, yourself, like, do you have any advice for someone in that position maybe that feels like, I can't go through this again?
I think for me, there was, I actually stopped reporting at one police station in particular because they just they kept, there was a AVO and it was pretty black and white. And every time I called, they'd be like, oh, that's kind of in the gray area, and it got to the point where he had actually turned up and tried to take one of the children from childcare under the AVO. And they were like, oh, it's in the gray area. And at that stage, I just was like, I am not. And I chose to go to the bigger police station in the bigger town, kind of 30 or 40 kilometers away. And they took me seriously and they acted on it. And from there, I had to move around a few times, but I've had really strong relationships with a couple of police officers in different areas. And I think when you find someone that can see what the behavior is, it's hard to see it, but when you find someone that does, I would continue to report back to that person. And even the smallest of breaches or the smallest of issues, just log them, like get them down on paper. It's, even if you're not leaving the relationship and you just want to have, something written down on paper to feel, for me, that in the end was very hard, is that, the courts can't prosecute a perpetrator for domestic violence unless there's forensic evidence. In Ireland and the UK, those laws have changed and there's coercive control and other things that they can be prosecuted against. But from the last I knew, you have to have forensic evidence, which means every little thing prior to me leaving, I would have had to have reported. And women are not in the place to report those things when they're in the relationship, because that's not safe. But I think as soon as you can, if you can, I had one police officer that asked me to sit down and give the history of the entire relationship. And she sat and wrote a 45-page affidavit, and she insisted that I just record that at that time. And it was really hard and really traumatic, but those documents then continue to add up. And I think you just have to find, a DV worker that you really resonate with, or that has supported you, that might go with you, or a counselor or someone that might, and finding a police officer or a liaison officer that actually can see the behavior for what it is, and then you just have them on speed dial. I think it's hard because, everyone has a bad day. Like a police officer is going to have a good and bad day. We're all like capable of, not fully being present to listen. The amount of stuff they're juggling and coping with on every day, they have to risk assess and be like, is this worth even following up? Where for you, you're feeling it's life or death, and you're just being fobbed off. I think for me, I just kept going back to the people that would listen, and it takes, I don't know, it takes some strength to keep doing it, because you pick at the wound every time and sometimes you're not ready for that. But like, there were times where I'd just write the stuff down, and then at another time when the next thing happened, I'd report the other 3 or 4 things that I wasn't at the strength to do at that time. So keeping kind of a diary or a log of things also is good for when you get that burst of strength, because you're not in your strength and power every day as you're recovering yourself. And for me, I was raising 3 kids while I was doing it, and so
Absolutely. I think that's
and just to reiterate what Áine said there, it's very important not to give up, like to go back, and someone you said, until you find someone that's listened, and also to document everything. Take screenshots of text messages, or photographs of injuries, of marks, of bruises. Very, very important to have all that. And if you can have a copybook somewhere and hit somewhere that you can write everything down, it's very important for when you do find that person to listen to you.
That's great, Marie. I guess probably one of my final questions before we open it up to anyone that's listening is, as friends and family members, how can we manage our expectations when it comes to the survivor journey? For example, if they return to their partner, how can we, as service providers or friends or family, as I said, try not to feel disheartened or not offer out that hand for support the next time around? Is that something maybe Saoirse you would like to?
Was that for me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just having some problems again. Sorry. Oh, here we go. Can I just add to the last piece as well, as just as a therapist, obviously, we do like some on the ground work as well. But I would just also add to have like a team of people, because like the more you've got like documented with your GP, your counsellor, your workers, so then you've got a lot of kind of evidence, but also be really mindful that the people that you're speaking to actually really see the violence for like what it is. So because sometimes what women can find is that they go to GP and they're like, the GP might say, oh, they've got depression or they've got PTSD or something, but what you actually want the GP and the counsellor to write is actually almost quotes from you as someone who might be going through it, to make sure that your voice is as like recorded like as possible. So there's lots of sources. Just to add to what was being said, I feel like a little kind of set the same around this question about managing expectations. And I think one of the first things to say would be, it's very understandable as friends and family to want the best for the people that you care about. And I guess I'm curious as to what gets in the way of people who are going through violence actually wanting to speak to their closest people. And I think sometimes it's because of like the expectations actually. So sometimes having like those expectations because you love and care about somebody can get in the way maybe at times of people feeling that they can speak up like to what's happening, because as we said before, we don't want to take someone's agency, their sense of agency. And also really thinking about the hundreds of reasons why somebody might choose to stay. If you're in a state where you feel trapped within a partnership, you might be worrying about money, like homelessness. You might not have those answers that we spoke about like prior, about things like visas. You might be feeling, like isolated, like enough to just think that it's better. It might be better to stay and for things to be a bit hard some of the time, but
Oh, I think it's frozen a little more this time.
I think that like sense of, Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Things just changed. No. Can you hear me again?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. You know, like what Áine was saying before is so important, that like the abuser may actually be cunning enough to have created doubt in the like community, so that when you choose to like disclose and speak to what has actually occurred, community of people might talk to or maybe turn to may actually cast doubt upon your experience. So you might leave and then come back because it fits with the social circles. You can handle X, Y, and Z. You're very skilled at handling the hard things, or like in order to maybe not risk being even more kind of isolated. So I would say things we said before, what you like speak up to what your kind of expectations that things are going to change straight away, and also like being able to like to understand that family court systems can be barriers. There's lots of barriers out there, but with the right supports, etc., obviously the person and the children can be like supported to safety when they're ready. But there might need to be a lot of safety planning and some more like testing of the waters before the person's actually ready to leave. And in fact, it's not it. You know, I hear of it a lot less than I hear of the alternative, but it is possible for men to change their behaviour and violence. The more you know, men take like responsibility for that, seek support, seek treatment, then it might actually be that the person wants to go back to their partner, because the person may in some cases actually be like genuinely trying to change. I say that with a little bit of note of hesitation, because sometimes that's part of the coercion that's used to have a woman come back. But I also want to maintain the fact that it is possible for men, if they seek the right treatment, to change their behaviour. So it's up to the woman, it's up to the man, you know, to work out what that balance is like for them. But I would say that every situation is very like unique, and that we can't apply the same brush like to everything. And that there's lots of reasons why somebody might choose to go back or to stay. And as someone who loves that person or like really cares about that person, it's just important to stay like connected and for them to know that you're there when and if they need your support.
All right, thank you so much, Saoirse. And look, now I'm just going to see if anyone would like to ask any questions. You can put it in the chat box for now. I'll maybe give you a few seconds to type, and if not, we can wrap up, okay?
Sorry, Katrina, can I just ask a question?
Of course, yes.
No, so just thanks so much for this, because I've learned so much. And it was many years ago, I was actually dealing with a really good friend who, you know, when I look back, it was domestic violence, and it wasn't something that was ever spoke about or anything. But Áine, you mentioned about, you know, just calling it out if something isn't right. And there was so much fear for me to do that. I felt so afraid because she had a lot of close friends. And it's quite funny you say that, because I was a work colleague, so I wasn't a close friend, but I still had that fear around just saying something initially. Like, I didn't know how to do it. Mm-hmm. And she had lost a lot of her close friends because they've obviously stepped up. I'm just wondering, like, for some of the listeners, maybe they're in the same position, and is there some advice you could give about how we could approach the topic? Maybe that's for Saoirse, or I don't know.
I would say maybe that's like for Áine, myself, unless that's putting you on the spot, Áine, but I think maybe you could, is that okay to speak to your experience?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, even to the last question as well, like it sort of applies as in family and friends, and that journey I've had through losing friends, having a strained relationships with my family, and now having it all come back and sort of full circle. And for me, even recently, there was a documentary about my journey, and I've done a lot of interviews and stuff recently, and some very old friends and even, you know, cousins and family that I thought kind of knew my story have just been like, that explains so much, you know, like they're kind of seeing things with a totally different lens. And to answer like that question, I would say there's probably no simple answer. I had, you know, my dad probably would have been the closest to advocating for me to kind of leave, and that was used in my relationship as like I felt very pulled between my dad and my partner for quite a long time, and that was by design by my partner from the very, very early stages. And my dad had to kind of just bite his tongue to be able to keep a relationship with me, but luckily he did. And you know, but I think if he had kept pushing me to leave, it would have pushed me away further. Do you know what I mean? But then also in hindsight, kind of my closest, like my brothers and sisters who would have been very close, who would have said some things along the way, they kind of wish in retrospect that they had come in a little bit harder and said a few things a little bit more honestly and truthfully early on. And I think the way that I've seen them reflect on it a lot in the last few months as well, with my story being a lot more public and us having some more conversations about it. And I think a thing that would be very useful, and it kind of only came to me in this conversation here, or in reflection of our conversation the other night to tonight, is that to pose questions back to the person as like, do they think that that is like respectful or safe? Is that the kind of relationship that they are looking for? Is that what they want their kids seeing? I think that's a lot more empowering, because it gives them something to go back and think about then in the, you know, sitting over a cup of tea, kind of reflecting on the chaos of the day, because you're in chaos all the time and it's very rare that you get these moments of peace. And so when you do, perhaps with a friend, the last thing you want is that friend to be like hammering you with more chaos, you know, because you're like, oh my God, I finally have a minute without that chaotic thought. But if you plant a few seeds, I think in forms of questions, I don't know whether Sorcha and Marie would agree. I think it's quite empowering for that person. And then they know that you're not completely judging that partner, you know, that you're not sitting there being like, well, he's just you know, whatever. You're actually just sitting there being like, is this really, you know, is this safe for you? Is this how you're feeling loved? Does this feel like love? You know, is this what you would want? You know, for me, I wasn't able to see it for myself. And when I saw my kids beginning to see this as normal, that's when I left. You know, it was very hard. I would have stayed, you know, I probably wouldn't be here right now, to be honest, to tell the story, but I would have stayed to the end. But I couldn't stay because I couldn't let my kids see that. So it's somehow trying to get your friend or your colleague or someone to start valuing them and what their gifts and who they are, and whether that's being met by the other person. And I think we do that regularly in conversations about our, you know, it's kind of like that Instagram thing. Like we go out there and we kind of give the best version of our relationships to our friends. But like, if you can start breaking down, just having some deeper conversations in general, and then, you know, like, then break it down to like where the relationship is at, you know, have some hard, tough conversations where you're questioning, you know, career and life and other things. And then maybe from that place you can start. But I think questions are more empowering than statements against the partner, because that sets this kind of like, as you said, you know, divide where she lost some friends along the way. Yeah.
would just add to that. I mean, I totally agree. And I think what I find is that for like a lot of women, it's when the children get affected that there is a shift that kind of happens. I sometimes find in talking to women that it's helpful to like reflect on what advice they might give to someone else who was going through the same thing. So that can be helpful to kind of separate yourself. And also, I just wanted to say that like, that's in the context often of a woman who's experienced violence being told that it's all her fault. So when and then there's a sense of loyalty that gets set up with the person. So it can be really confronting to the person's sense of like reality when someone is siding with a woman, saying that maybe what they're thinking is actually right, and that their gut instincts and what they would say like for other women are actually maybe something that they could be thinking about like for themselves. So yeah, I find that that's really helpful because of the depth of like emotional like abuse that some women have experienced, that it can be hard to see that maybe their gut feelings were right all along, you know. And the other thing I would also say is that, you know, part of what is going to address violence against women in the long term is that we've got to speak up when our voice shakes. You know, we've got to be able to have these conversations when in the way that is right for that particular person, but in as gentle and as soft a way as possible, but it being really clear that there's something just not quite right about what's happening, you know, because as you said, like before, Áine, the more we don't speak out, it more violence against women is like maintained as a norm within our world. And I know that's not what any of us want, you know, like individually, but we've all got a role in that, to just kind of leaning in even when it feels awkward. Yeah.
Look, I think given the time we're going to have to finish up here, we could honestly speak all night, and I just think that is such a powerful note to end on, is speak even though our voice shakes. I want to thank in particular Áine, Marie and Saoirse so much for joining us, and for everyone else that's tuned in tonight. I want to encourage people to reach out. You can get in touch with ourselves at the Irish Support Agency, and we can connect you to all of these amazing services that we've spoken about, and also be a support to you as well, should you ever need it. And look, thank you again, and good night.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thanks
you
so
Thanks
much.
so much.
Lovely
Thank you.
to chat.
Thank you.